I met Jim because of the Commanding General of the U.S. Army Special Operations Command. He emailed me and told me about Jim and said, this is somebody you need to meet and you need to know. And so, so he was in D.C. and we met and talked to me about his organization. And I said, wow, that's, this is an organization that really has application, unique application to security studies. And of course, he's going to get into some details. But everybody talks about, of course, military operations, what we're doing overseas in Afghanistan, Iraq, or did in Iraq, and Africa, and the like. And we talk about military operations, we talk about security, and we talk about whole of government. And obviously, getting all the interagency involved in these operations. But what Jim brings is something that has long been missing, and something that I think is very, very important, and that's whole of nation. Jim is an accomplished businessman, an entrepreneur, and brings an entirely different perspective to the work that he does in support of national security, U.S. national security operations overseas. And it's a great partnership that he has established with his private organization and experts on his staff. We're experts really, I'd say, in problem solving, finding creative solutions, filling gaps in our government capabilities, our military capabilities, and partnering with our military and our government organizations to help accomplish and contribute to accomplishing our strategic objectives. And so I think this is, to me, I was fascinated. I wish that in my experience in the military that I'd known Jim. You know, in my conversations with him, and Dave Luton, you can attest to this, our work in the Philippines, it would have been great to have an organization as creative and flexible and focused on problem solving to bring capabilities that we surely could have exploited. And now today, our troops in Afghanistan and in Africa, our civil affairs, but really all of our forces that partner with Jim really benefit from the spirit of America. And so, without further ado, I'd like to present Jim Hake to you, and he will give his presentation. And then he is prepared for a very robust Q&A. He expects that you will have some very thought-provoking questions, and he'll be ready for that. So I've prepared him for all of you. So don't hold back. So without further ado, Jim, thank you.
Thank you. It was great to meet Professor Maxwell back when we got together, and not only because it was one of the few days that there wasn't snowfall during the winter, but I think there's a great match between some of the questions that we're asking and some of the approaches that we're using with Spirit of America, and some of the things I'm sure you all are thinking about studying and trying to figure out from a very deep standpoint. So, as Dave said, I'm all for your questions, but I'm going to start off with a couple of my own. I'd just like to know how many of you may be military veterans? Okay. Having been in the State Department at any point in time? Internship? Okay. USAID? Peace Corps? All right. Thank you. So, as I go along, if there are things that you really want to jump into and ask about, please do that. And certainly, when it's all through, we can do that as well. So, I'm the founder of this organization, Spirit of America, and we are a privately funded, nonprofit, 501c3 organization, and we provide humanitarian, economic, and civic assistance in direct response to U.S. troops and diplomats in about a total of 21 countries around the world, one of which is Afghanistan, of course. And what we have developed with this is what I think can be a game-changing benefit for how our country operates and engages abroad. And that is by bringing citizens in the private sector in as partners with what our country is trying to accomplish in some of the toughest parts of the world. So I'm going to tell you about that, give you a few examples. but and also try to ask and give a shot at these two questions. So, looking back at the last 12, 13 years, especially since the post 9/11 era, I'm sure you all are looking at these questions yourselves. What have we learned, and how can we do better? And there are a million things I think that we've learned, and you're studying many of them, I'm sure. I'm going to just toss out three that are both lessons learned or lessons relearned, perhaps, and the top-level picture that drives our organization. One is that most people in the world simply want a better life. They're not interested in taking up arms against the United States, our allies, or anyone else. They want a better life for themselves and their children. Second is that America matters. We are coming out of a tough 13 years since 9/11. A lot of disappointments along the way, things that haven't worked as well as we hoped, things that one can argue should or shouldn't have been done. But where we're coming from is that America's leadership is still critically important, and America's engagement is still critically important to helping people around the world achieve that better life. And the third thing is we can do better and we have to do better. So that brings us to the question, well, how do we do that? And in addition to telling you about the work that we do, I'll tell you a little bit of the story of how I got into this. My background is an internet and technology entrepreneur, kind of grew up professionally in Silicon Valley, and that bottom question is what led me to start this organization. So, as I said, when the attacks of 9/11 occurred, I, like many people, wanted to do something to help. Now, I didn't have any government or military background, I had no nonprofit background, no development, NGO background. Nothing I had done seemed to be relevant to that question of how I can help. So, and I'll say that was, in some ways, a very good thing. So, it took a while to figure out what would actually be useful. And I was thinking about that, and one night, back in the days when people still channel surfed, this was 2003, February of 2003, I saw this, and it was a National Geographic show about a special forces team in Afghanistan in a village called Urgut. And this image really kind of captured my attention. It was Afghan boys and girls playing baseball with special forces soldiers. And so on this team, Sherry told the story about this team. They were assigned to this village. Their job was to basically track down Al-Qaeda part of the time and to do civil affairs work part of the time, building a school and that kind of thing. But this story was interesting. So this soldier here, Sergeant First Class Jay Smith, was talking about how this whole baseball thing came together. And so what happened, he and one of his guys took over a baseball mitt and ball so they could have something to do in their free time. They let the kids, Afghan boys, who were working for them in their kitchen, use them, play with them. And the kids really got into it. So Jay used a sat phone to call his wife Diane back in Fayetteville and said, honey, can you buy enough bats, balls, and mitts so these kids can play a real game? So Diane raises money from friends, family, co-workers, buys the gear, sends it over to Jay, and one thing leads to another, and here these kids are playing baseball. Now, I'm probably among the many people would think, well, who in Afghanistan wants to play baseball? But in this case, it actually worked. So what really captured my attention about this, a couple of things. One is that Jay did this as a relationship building project with the people of this village, and the children especially. And he did it on his own initiative. DOD did not say, hey, we need to have baseball in Afghanistan. This was just as grassroots as you get. And he did it with help from people back home. So that was one of these entrepreneurial light bulb moments where I thought there have to be other men and women like Jay who are trying to affect some positive change in some distant part of the world. They are our true ambassadors. They shape the perceptions of the U.S. and Americans more than any official ambassador probably does. And more of them, like Jay, probably want some help to help the local population. And I was sure that there would be a lot of people like me who, if they only knew what was needed, would be happy to help. So that was the idea. And the first thing I did, I probably learned this the hard way through business entrepreneurship, was whatever my bright idea is, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, but you have to get the ground truth from people who really know what they're talking about. So I tracked down Jay, the producer of the show, flew to Fort Bragg, met with him and his team, and laid out the idea, which is just what I said. You or guys like you need something that you can't get through government channels to help the local population build better relationships, whatever it is. And instead of contacting your families, you can contact my organization, and we'll use the internet to get people to help. So, that's a pretty simple idea. So Jay and his guys were pretty much bouncing out of their chairs about this, and Jay kept saying, this is great, this will save lives. And the first 2 times he said it, I thought he was just being enthusiastic. So the third time he said it, I asked him why he was saying it, and he explained that because of the relationships that his team had built with the local population, the villagers in Oregon formed a night watch patrol to protect the US team from Al-Qaeda that had been crossing the Pakistan border at night and firing rockets on their camp. So he really meant it when he said this kind of thing saves lives. And at that point, if you've ever been part of a startup organization or been an entrepreneur, you're always looking for a reason not to do it, because it's hard work, right? And but at that point, I knew I had to work on this, and I would never forgive myself if I didn't work on it. So, in this conversation with Jay, I said, okay, I'm going to do it. And at that point in time, when I decided to launch Spirit of America, or get it started, Sergeant First Class Jay Smith was the highest level military person I knew or had talked to. Now, that turns out to have been maybe brilliant, but I just didn't know better. It never occurred to me that, my thought was, if it makes sense to him and it makes sense to me, well, we'll figure out everything in between, which we ended up doing. So that led to this idea of bringing flexible private sector assistance and direct support of US personnel in deployed environments, and what's become Spirit of America. And I called it Spirit of America to reflect what I saw embodied in Jay and his team, which was that combination of initiative and generosity and optimism that, in some ways, I think we define who we are as a nation. So we've done projects in support of US missions in 21 countries, only 2 of them active war zones with respect to Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'll talk a little bit about the outside of the war zone piece and really focus on that as part of the way ahead. But, and we've also, we worked mainly with military teams, but we also have projects going on with purely on the civilian side with the Department of State Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, CSO, and this approach works equally well whether it's military or civilian or civil military. Essentially, this approach is great for anybody who is representing our nation who is trying to get work done, is how I'll put it. So if they're not trying to get work done, we don't hear from them, and they don't hear from us, but if they are, then we're a really good partner. So I'm going to give a couple of examples. First with Afghanistan. So Panjwai is a district in Kandahar province, and it is known as the birthplace of the Taliban. So that's interesting in and of itself. The situation there got worse, much worse, in March of 2012. You all may recall the soldier who was both charged and then convicted of the massacre of about 16 civilians in the middle of the night. Just a terrible, tragic thing. So that made a tough neighborhood, a tough district, that much tougher. So we were the only non-governmental organization. We have personnel on the ground, military veterans like Ryan Frost, who's up in the front of the room here, who are our field operations team. So all our field operations team are all US military veterans who have served in Iraq or Afghanistan. So we have folks on the ground in Afghanistan. And we had folks in Kandahar, and in fact, very close by Panjwai district, back at this point in time. So, and we were the only NGO around at that point. So we ended up, over the following year, providing more support and more assistance in Padway District than any other district that we had worked in or been involved with previously. So I'll give a couple of examples of that. We essentially did on the order of 45 different projects totaling the large sum of money of $50,000. And again, I'll give you a couple of examples of what we did there. But when you look at the world of aid and assistance, $50,000 is, it's not even a rounding error. It's just a tiny amount of money. But everything that we did that I'll describe was fast, flexible, decentralized, and highly targeted. So that assistance didn't start in Washington and end up in a village or district. It started in that village or district and went exactly where it was needed, and not defined by us, but defined by the U.S. team. In that case, it was a special operations team and their Afghan partners. So everything was in response to the needs that they identified and what they said was important. So a couple of examples. The first couple of projects involved helping Afghan local police and Afghan security forces, helping our own personnel help their military partners. So this, one of the things was tourniquets, so that the Afghans could save their lives if they were wounded. Didn't have that, couldn't get it through their supply channels. It was basically beans and bullets that they could get through their supply channels. These things which are more nice to haves couldn't get. So that was one thing. Now a tourniquet for a crusty Afghan policeman, not exactly a conventional definition of humanitarian assistance, but it was what was needed. We did it. Then provided some medical gear to help the Afghan security forces interact with and build better relations with the population themselves. So the U.S. folks were literally in the background here on a project like that. This project was the obvious piece of it was a water filtration system that was distributed to village elders in Padway District, and so that was the obvious piece of it. The reason for doing this project, and everything that we do has a backstory and probably a backstory to backstory. In this case, the water filtration was a means to an end. The end was building better relations between the district governor and I forget the word, the water authorities, the kind of informal players who decide what happens with water in Padway. So the district governor, an Afghan, did not know who these folks were, didn't have relationships with them. So this project was a catalyst for getting those pieces, those dots connected. And it was very successful because of that. And last example is there was a radio station that had been stood up by the U.S. team with U.S. funds. What they didn't have funding for and couldn't get in the time to do this was the equipment needed to do call-in radio. So the local population could call in and bellyache to the district governor or any other authority and express their well, probably mainly grievances. That's what people tend to call it about. Probably very few nice jobs. But anyway, that was a critical thing to establish that connection between the district governor and the local population. So, getting more and more support, 45 different projects, those are just a few. And then, it all additive to what the U.S. team was trying to do in that area. And then a really remarkable thing happened. A year later, and this was both of these stories that I have up there were in the New York Times. Probably mostly went unnoticed in many respects. But the Afghans themselves organized an uprising against the Taliban and kicked the Taliban out of Padway District, or worked to kick the Taliban out of Padway District. And that success story is still going on. Again, it's not necessarily a solution for all of Afghanistan, but it was a really interesting achievement led by the U.S. team and their Afghan partners. But Dave mentioned General Cleveland, and he recently said this, which is, it gets to the question of, well, how do we do better? Because we don't want more Afghanistans. We're going to try to avoid this. So how do we prevent conflict? How do we get to these problems while they're still easier to address so they don't become full-blown crises. And that's where, over the last couple of years, we have been working closely with U.S. civil military teams in these so-called phase 0 environments, the conflict prevention and stability operations. And how that came to be was in July or summer of 2011, civil affairs personnel with whom we had worked in Iraq and Afghanistan basically said, "Will you guys come to Fort Bragg, talk to us about what we're doing outside of Afghanistan. We think the need for and the potential positive impact of what Spirit of America can do is, the need is greater and the potential impact is greater outside than inside Afghanistan." And so, as I pretty much always do, again, having established that I didn't know anything about this to begin with, why? And so they, the reason for the need was, highly complex, dynamic environments, very few flexible resources that the military teams especially could draw upon. If you're familiar with CERP, the Commander's Emergency Response Program, that funding doesn't exist outside of Afghanistan. You have, the older, more Cold War-oriented bureaucracies to tap into. ODACA funding for military teams is chief among them. And on the, I said, well, why is the impact going to be greater? And they looked at me with a strange look. They said, well, everything works better when there's not a war going on. I said, yeah, okay, got it. One of the first two places we got on the ground was in Mauritania in West Africa. Because our approach is, and we insist upon it really, we don't have to fight for it, but we wouldn't do anything otherwise, is to get with the people who are closest to a particular problem, challenge, or need, and be in direct communication and collaboration with them, literally side by side. So, because it's not ill-intentioned, but no matter what anyone says at a higher level, we verify it with the people who are closest to it. And it can only work that way, in our view. So, Mauritania is a good example of this approach. The Army captain, shown there, was tasked with, both by the ambassador and by SOC Africa, the Special Operations Command for Africa, with this basic guidance. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb is exerting its influence in the eastern part of the country, far from the capital, which is on the coast, far from the capital, causing problems, trying to create more problems. Get out there, figure it out, and do something. Which, you kind of hear that and you say, well, they had to tell them more than that, right? Yeah, and don't fire any weapons, it's not a combat operation thing, it's, get this figured out, do something to prevent the combat or kinetic piece of it. So he and his team did a brilliant job of that. And when we met up with them, they had done multiple assessments out in 7 different villages along that border area with Mali. And the issue that they had identified that the local population cared most about was livestock health. And livestock health to the people in these villages was more important than human health, more important than education, whatever else you might think of, that was what they cared about. So, I'll just, point of comparison. So we didn't go out there and say, well, I know what needs to be done, and start doing it. He listened and built those relationships. Critical thing, simple, but easier said than done. So our question was, well, what are you going to do about it? And then the second question is, how can we help? So what Steve said was that his plan was to tap into ODACA funding, which I could probably remember what that stands for, but I'm not going to try, for building vaccination parks in seven villages along that border area. So a vaccination park is essentially a big corral that allows you to treat animals more efficiently, from a veterinary standpoint. Otherwise, they're wandering, cattle and goats are wandering around the desert, and it's harder to do. So a vaccination park is infrastructure. But it's only infrastructure, and without people who know how to treat animals, it's maybe worthless. You know, anyway. So you need the soft skills to go along with it. So anyway, we started to talk about how we could play a role to complement what he could do with government resources, but that he himself could never do with government resources. And the first thing that we did was put together an expert network of people who knew more about livestock health in sub-Saharan Africa than any of us, certainly on our team. And that network included a USDA rep in Senegal, someone from Heifer International, someone from Vets Without Borders, a Tufts professor who had done animal health worker, community animal health worker work in Afghanistan, and about 6 other people. And so we built a mini brain trust. So if you're trying to solve a problem, if you can tap into people who know more about it than you do, it's a really good, it's really helpful. And they provided great advice to us. So anyway, what we ended up doing in Spirit of America with private funds was funded the training and equipping and providing business assistance to locally chosen men to go into business as veterinarians, with the goal of them making money by solving their community's biggest need and biggest problem. To do that, we worked with the, so this is one of the veterinarians in action, by the way. We worked with the, we contracted with the Mauritanian Center for Veterinary Research. So they were based in the capital. They had all the expertise needed to train and mentor these guys, but they didn't have the funding to do it. Because these are folks who are out kind of from a international aid and assistance and even government standpoint, out in a little bit of no man's land. You know, it's just hard to get to, it's insecure, difficult. So anyway, we funded them to do that training and mentoring, provided them with startup medications and startup equipment. You know, that device there that's being used to inject the cattle. And did one thing that was really interesting and in retrospect an obvious thing to do, especially given my background in business, but I would have totally missed without this expert network. So the experts, I forget which couple of them it was, but they said, well, you know, the training is great, it's essential, but it's only half the thing these guys need. And they said they need to be able to market their services to skeptical herdsmen. You know, I'm thinking, well, of course they do, right? Because anybody in business, you know, opening a store, well, people just don't walk in and start buying. You know, you have to market yourself, right? And especially in a place where, you know, people were quite frugal, let's say, with what they invest their money in. So as a result of that, we, working with all the players in this, which I'll show you some of the picture of all the folks that were involved, organized testing where these veterinarians would go out to their herds in their areas. They would do ABC testing, so the A cattle got treated with the quality medication, the B cattle got treated with the kind of knockoff generic one that, you know, if you really know about veterinary medicine, you know that that doesn't work. And the C group was the control group. They received nothing. And then 3 months later, went back, the veterinarians went back and they tagged and measured everybody, all the cattle, and then came back to do it again. So, and it worked. It worked beautifully, which has since helped these guys market their services. So I'm going to show technology and eyesight willing here, show a video that the Armed Forces Network, or a piece of a video, I should say, that the Armed Forces Network put together in this project, just to give you a picture of life in rural Mauritania.
In Mauritania, livestock is the cornerstone of society. Unfortunately, however, vaccination and veterinary care is often not available in rural villages. So a U.S. Army Civil Affairs team is working with a U.S. non-governmental organization to help alleviate that problem.
So that's really good for the community.
These veterinarians are individuals from each community that were selected by the elders of that village to receive training so they can provide an extra level of veterinary care in these remote locations. Mohammed Wal Sidi is the trained veterinarian for the village of Muraktab.
It is a big honor for me to work as an auxiliary for them because they trust me and they chose me among many other people.
Each veterinarian was also given a starter kit of medication to show the communities the importance of using quality veterinary care. When families are able to produce healthy cattle, the need for government support goes way down.
It's very necessary to enjoy and spend time with them because it's more than just a business opportunity for them. This is their way of life. Livestock is very important to them. This whole project is very important to them, and they accept you as one of their family when you visit these communities.
After building rapport with the mayor and the members of the village, the team joins the veterinarian auxiliaries as they take measurements, blood, and fecal samples from the cattle.
We took 3 groups of cows. The first group we treated with a high-quality deworming medication, the second group with a generic one, and the third group with nothing, without any treatment at all. And within 2 months, we saw a big difference between the ones treated with high-quality medication and the other 2 groups.
Lieutenant Colonel Lamine is the team leader of the newly established Mauritanian Civil Affairs team. He sees 2 positives coming out of the livestock program. Farmers are able to raise healthy, marketable cattle, and there's less opportunity for subversive organizations to get a foothold in the region.
If you have a civil populace with some problems, and the government is not there to help them out, then if a terrorist organization gets to them first, before the government, they will gain the trust of the populace.
Because livestock is so significant to the region and the livestock herders rely so much on their livestock, if there's a bad season, they are forced to migrate to Mali across the porous borders, and by supporting the communities that are along the Malian border, it helps to prevent the spread of the violence that's happening in Mali from coming across the border into Mauritania.
Part of AFRICOM's mission statement proposes enabling our African partners so they can create secure environments which promote stability, improved governance, and continued development. And the Mauritanian Livestock Program is a huge step in that direction.
So a couple of the details about this. We first met with this team in November of 2011. It took a little while to figure out what needed to be done, but we committed to provide that training in January. We started getting organized, and this was in close collaboration, literally side by side with the U.S. Civil Affairs team operating out of the embassy. So that the training got started, it began to be organized when we made that commitment. The auxiliaries were trained in the spring. The test program was done started in the end of the summer, August. Was wrapped up with the phase 2 part of it in November. And all the while, the vaccination parks hadn't happened. And it took, for those vaccination parks to be built, it took about 13 months to happen. It was on multiple, they finally got built on the 3rd team's rotation in there after we had shown up. So, and that's not uncommon for, it was about $100,000 of government money in that case, for that to be a longer process. It's, the nature of taxpayer money, there's restrictions on it and processes you have to follow. So for the team, by being able to have this progress happening with the veterinarians along the way, which started, a couple of months after we met, they, as Captain Atkinson said, they ended up being welcomed in these communities like family. And so, one of the objectives, often one of the objectives for the things that we do with military personnel is that access to and engagement with local populations. That's a core part of the objective. So they were able to have that access and engage with the population in a very positive and productive way as a result of this project. As I said, the vaccination parks did get built. What we spent on that, and it's still going on, what we spent on that was out of pocket about $100,000, direct cost, the training and so forth and so on. And about $100,000 in indirect costs, our staff time and travel and that sort of thing. So again, in the world of aid and assistance, tiny amounts of money. But I would say that any less would have been not enough, and any more would have been too much. Now, one interesting story along the way is that somewhere, because we provided these gentlemen with startup medications. And one of the interactions after they were started, they said, well, can you give us some more medication, please? And basically what we said was no. The idea is you sell what we gave you, use that money to buy more. They said, oh, okay. So, like anyone, if they got something, they might try to get more, but they were good with that. And we just were back in Mauritania about 3 weeks ago and met with the veterinarians, met with the Mauritanian agency that trained them, spent a few days there. And the veterinarians are doing great. There are a few measures of that. One is that they are making money. They're sustaining themselves doing these, providing these services. And one of the main things, which is possibly a little bit subtle but really important, is they now have a relationship with the regional and national government that they never had before. So these villages are connected to that, to the Mauritanian governance, which is a key dimension of stability in these environments. Because again, out in these areas, there's not a lot of love shown to these folks for all kinds of reasons. In Mauritania, when we did this in these areas, there were no NGOs doing anything. For most of the project, USAID did not have a representative in Mauritania. It wasn't a priority enough country. No fault of USAID, just out. And so this is a picture of all the folks that were involved, the partners, the veterinarians, the folks who trained them, the local military, the local, the local leaders, and so forth. So it was a true team effort that I characterized this by, with, and through approach of especially special operations teams. So in doing this, what I would say somewhat stumbled into really is a very interesting new model for how the U.S. can engage in, I'll say, any environment, but especially these security challenged areas. And the core principles or core ideas which we're applying are: 1, decentralization; 2, private-public partnership, private-public collaboration; and 3, a not neutral approach. So decentralized meaning we work, as I said earlier, to the people who are closest to a need, issue, challenge, or problem. We are side by side with them. The communication and collaboration is close and ongoing. We also work with the local people and partners, so we're involved in those discussions with them. The private piece is obviously we're privately funded. We tap into private expertise, resources, know-how, as we did in Mauritania. And the not neutral piece is interesting, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment, but it's essentially that we are providing support that is not neutral. It is in direct alignment with, and intentionally and clearly so, in support of U.S. national security interests. So we're at the intersection of humanitarian need, national interest, and security challenge. That's where we focus our support. So if you have some military experience, you might be saying, well, that sounds great, but isn't it illegal? And there's an interesting story which I'll share with you about that. Some thought so. So the organization, as I said, was started in 2003. I ran it for the first couple of years, turned it over to a small staff, and came back to run the organization in end of 2009. And at that point, we were essentially an idea from the Marines we had worked with a lot in Iraq and then Afghanistan came out, which is, well, let's get Spirit of America personnel on the ground, side by side with us, instead of doing things remotely. So we would send goods remotely, sewing machines or whatever else, but we didn't have personnel on the ground until that point. So the Marines were on board with that idea from stem to stern. We had hired our first person to be the test case Army Captain Matt Valkovic. When the attorneys at CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, responsible for the Middle East and Central Asia, said, well, hold on, you can't do that. There is no legal basis for our providing support for a non-federal entity, because we're not a contractor. So we, to have your guys eat our chow and stay on our bases can't do it. And you can't do what you've been doing for 7 years either, because if a soldier Marine says Afghan women need sewing machines provided for their families, and that will support the village stability operations, that's actually an improper solicitation of gifts, and it violates ethics regulations. So, you go, well, that doesn't sound good. So a couple of things happened that shook that loose. But that, the gift solicitation question had such a freezing effect on this notion of private-public collaboration that military personnel just thought, well, we can't talk to people. We can't even talk to them because that will be, we'll run afoul of ethics regulations. So as it turns out, we had operated under the radar for 7 years, built this great body of experience, mostly but not entirely with the Marines. And again, if I talked to anybody above Sergeant First Class J. Smith, I probably would have been stopped in 2003. But we made it that far. So two things happened. A great attorney took us on as a pro bono client. His name is John Bellinger. He was the general counsel at Department of State and the general counsel at the National Security Council, working under Condoleezza Rice in both places from under the two Bush administrations. So we understood these issues quite a bit. He linked us up with, or we set a meeting with Jay Johnson, who was the general counsel at DOD, and Lee Bradley, the head of the Standards of Conduct Office, and we laid out, here are the issues. And I said, that's funny. It seems like this would be really easy to resolve. So we're not even sure. So they asked, are the Marines telling you this just to give you the stiff arm, to have a reason not to have you collaborate or work with them? But we'd worked with the Marines for quite a long time, so we knew that wasn't the case. So the interesting piece of it was there was this big disconnect between folks at the combatant command level and DOD. One thinks, well, you can't do it. And the other thinks, well, it's easy to do. What's the problem? Now, DOD does not, is not in the business of giving, unsolicited advice down to the lower levels in the combatant commands. So this guidance that we ended up getting from the Office of General Counsel was critical, but the other piece, which was just lucky to resolve it, was that General Mattis replaced General Petraeus, who replaced General McChrystal in Afghanistan. So General Mattis had seen what we had done with and in support of his Marines for 7 years at that point. He and the current ISAF commander, General Joe Dunford, were the first two general officers that I met after starting this organization in December of 2003. So the commander's intent to his staff was get this figured out, but that would not have been sufficient without the guidance from the General Counsel. So long story short, there's been a lot of work done on the policy and legal side. It is foundational that, to this approach, and it opens the system to not just Spirit of America doing this, but to other organizations who hopefully will follow our example and say, well, yeah, we can provide assistance and support of what our troops and diplomats are trying to do. So others hopefully will enter the system as well. I'll just say one word on how the gift solicitation piece was resolved. And it was simply that it was actually really elegant, simple, and so much common sense you can almost hardly believe that it happened in a way. And that's not a criticism of anyone. But things, simple things can get complicated in these large organizations. So the solution to that was that if Spirit of America has an open request for information about the needs of local nationals, military personnel may respond. So that's the actual language. It's been burned into my memory. A more layman's version of it is, if any NGO, not just us, asks military personnel in a particular place, well, what do the people need here? How can we help? The military personnel are allowed to answer the question. Right? And you say, well, okay, viewed that way, that really makes sense. And if they don't answer the question, they should be fired, right? You would think. So anyway, that common sense prevailed, and the system was open. So the other part of why this is a new model is on this question of being not neutral. How many of you have heard of universal humanitarian principles? Most folks, okay. How many of you know what they are? I'm not going to ask you, well, maybe I don't know. I'm not going to ask you to say what they are, but how many of you actually know what those principles are? There are 4 of them, right. So anyway, so here's the thing, which is one of the reasons why this hadn't been done before. The legal piece was one part. The other is that what we're doing essentially violates 3 out of 4 universal humanitarian principles. I had, I'm kind of embarrassed to say, I had no idea about. I had heard of them, but we learned last spring that, well, we actually are not good on 3 of the 4, which of course, if I just left it at that, would make us sound like criminals. And so the 4 principles are neutrality, which means you don't take a side in any conflict or controversy. Second is independence. You operate independently from any government, military, political actor. Impartiality, which goes a lot like the first 2. And then humanity. So we were good on number 4, but the first 3 we didn't do. So why that's important is that, and so those principles were defined by the United Nations back in 1992. And they have come to shape the world of private international aid and assistance in a very profound way. So that right now on that neutral side, the folks who at least say they adhere to those principles, organizations, there are tens of billions of dollars that flow through that, which is obviously a lot of aid and assistance. Now, I'm not saying that that's wrong or anything else, but what we've seen is that not neutral piece is a really important category of support that can do things because of that approach that won't be done on the neutral side, that are critical to achieving the security and stability upon which better lives are built. So I'd say that the not neutral category is underserved and understood, if I can put it that way. Now, the interesting piece on the not neutral adversarial side is that those who have a different worldview than America and the West have this private assistance thing pretty well figured out, and it's happening all the time. There are 56 so-called charities which have been identified as linked to foreign terrorist organizations by the U.S. Treasury Department. And there was a story a couple of months ago about how various people, Hake in Kuwait and others, were raising money to fund the jihadist fight in Syria. And to the point where they had a whole system set up. Well, if you donate $100, you can buy X number of sniper rounds, and that gives you silver status. Gold status is you donate this much more, and you buy mortar rounds. And that's just happening out in the public. If guys have their signs hung out on street corners, and they were raising money for this. So, we don't do anything kinetic or weapons related. There's a clear line of anything associated with that. But that's what our folks are up against in some of these environments that you just wouldn't normally consider. And so if you view this idea of citizens as partners, which we've been working in, as I said, this decentralized, not neutral kind of way, there's a pretty long history of that kind of engagement on the part of our country. So this is a poster from World War II. And back then there was a very strong whole of nation approach. People, in this case, people are being asked to bring in scrap, wood and aluminum and tin and you name it, bring it in. It was all about, at the time, supporting the machinery of war, because that's what the situation called for. Now, fast forward to present times in the post 9/11 era, our country has the machinery of war well figured out. I mean, it operates without, people like me or anybody else needing to do anything to help it. But it's the machinery of peace that, that's the need now. That is, I'll say, in many respects, more complex and harder than figuring out the machinery of war. And that's where this, having the American people and private sectors in support of what our country's men and women are trying to accomplish, that's where there's a huge potential. And I think, you know, we've done things, as I said, in 21 countries, but I know that we have just scratched the surface of the potential impact of this model. It's what I've come to understand is just a fundamentally better way for our country to go about its business, if you want to put it that way, abroad. And so we'll see how things evolve. We are scaling up the organization to meet the needs in these, the world's most challenging environments, the world's toughest places. So, happy to have you all join the fracas here. That's my email address. I'm happy to, if you have any questions or thoughts after we're done today, please email me, but also please CC that address on the bottom so nothing falls through the cracks. Anyway, thanks for your attention, and let me know what you think. First of all, we won't do something that government funds can be used for, unless there's, literally kind of lives at stake in the very short term, and that's rarely. So number one, we won't do that. Number two, we say no more often than we say yes. Now, of course, we talk about the things mainly that we do, not the things that we don't do. And there are a variety of reasons for those things that we say no to. Sometimes the team that we're talking to and that's identifying the need hasn't fully thought through the problem and the approach. And I'll say, so we ask some fairly simple questions, but really important ones, like, well, how did you come to identify this is something to do? And in that, you come to see whether somebody really engaged with, talked to, responded to the local population, or just had a bright idea. And so we don't just support bright ideas unless they involve in some meaningful way the local population. We tend not to do infrastructure things because that's, government funding really is earmarked for that. And I'll give an example of something that it's kind of two dimensions of this question that Professor Maxwell and I were talking about just before this started. So we've done a couple of things in Guyana, which is right next to Venezuela. And there's an interesting set of security challenges there. This is all public source information. There's a concern about Iranian influence through Venezuela, destabilizing that country, so forth and so on. One of the things we were asked to help with by the team there was a fence around a youth center. So our first response was, no thank you. That's a good use of ODACA funding. But we also said, if we were to do it, we wouldn't just write a check and sign a contract with somebody. We would only do it if we could involve the youth that were at this, getting educated and so forth at this youth center, involve them in some kind of vocational training that had them help build the fence that was going, helping secure the place where they studied and worked. And so we'd have to be flexible with how we approached it. We just, wouldn't be a normal contracting process. It'd be, kind of handcrafted. And the team leader, the captain, said, this is a quote, "Wow, you guys could do that?" And I bring this up because the flexibility to take a different approach to things that doesn't fall within the contracting procedures and processes that are there for a good reason. It's to protect taxpayer money. But they don't always fit with what needs to happen on the ground to really achieve not just a particular objective, but to have the best possible effect. So anyway, the local partners in that case ended up not really doing their part to have some skin in the game with the project, so it didn't happen. But that's an example of something we said no to. And our projects are in that. Some are, like in the Panjway example, some were a few $100s. But they're typically between $5, $50, $100,000 is kind of is a very big one for us. Yeah.
So I think one thing that MIBs have been through this program, a consistent issue we run into looking at countries, particularly very fragile states, is the issue of finding quote-unquote good people to work with. So I'll look at Syria, for example. A lot of the analysts looking at the Syrian situation are looking at the ground and saying, there are no good guys here. That maybe there were good guys at one point, maybe there were people we could have worked with at one point, but they seem to have either been overwhelmed, or they're giving up, or they've gone to Lebanon, or whatever the case may be. So then the issue of looking at some of these areas, and it seems to me that trying to find the right people to work with, people who that we know are will work with us, will work in our national interests, can be very, very challenging. Especially when it may require tons of background knowledge, a ton of intelligence, talking to the right people who are not just trying to get back at somebody, or getting stuck in sort of these intertribal disputes and things like that. So how do you get around that without having the years of the intelligence collection and all of that? How do you sort of get in to find those right partners that are going to work with us in the ways we want them to?
Well, it's a great and extremely important question and issue. And we're all aware of mistakes with aid and assistance and CERP funds or anything else you want to say that have had many unintended consequences. And you just named a pretty good list of the possible ones. So the first thing is we really rely on the knowledge of the U.S. team that we work with. And that's not just a military team. In Afghanistan it mainly is. But outside, these are civilian-led missions, and there are other civilians operating there. There may not be a USAID rep, as I mentioned in Mauritania, but there are other folks. But the first thing we rely on is that, or the basic approach depends on, is that those folks, those teams, have a pretty good idea of what they're doing. Now, they don't always. Because these are really complex environments, and some people are new on the job, and all the rest of it. So we're not the experts in figuring that out ourselves, but we can get a pretty good sense of whether they figured it out by questions that we ask and the processes that they use, and then to spend enough time on the ground to get it, I'm pretty comfortable getting it right most of the time. So it's the old 80-20 rule where figure out 80% of what you need to know with 20% of the effort, and so that's really where our questions are focused on, getting it mostly right on the one hand, and secondly is operating on a scale where even if we don't get it right, it's not going to have drastic effects on stability in a particular area. And I would contrast that with Rajiv Chandrasekaran wrote a book called Little America about the shortcomings of the large-scale aid and assistance programs that try to do big things and squeeze them into tiny places. And anyway, I won't try to summarize the book for you, but that decentralized bottom-up approach, again, nothing always works, but minimizes the downside in that case. But the core thing is the U.S. team, and teams have improved drastically over the time we've been doing this. The U.S. team needs to be in the lead on figuring that out. If they're not, there's not too much we're going to be able to do about it. We can provide advice, but we're not the so-called smartest guy in the room.
I also suspect the size of the project and the requirement for skin in the game also self-selects the people out.
It does, and that skin in the game can be can vary. Sometimes just doing something puts someone at great security risk. So their skin in the game is their lives are on the line to do it. In the case of these veterinarians that I mentioned, they were nominated by their communities. So this was an honor for them to do this, to be the person in their village that solved their village's biggest problem, or helped solve it. And so you have that kind of social infrastructure that makes it less likely somebody's going to, not come through. Again, not guarantees, but it narrows the probability of failure. Well, there are a couple of dimensions of that, and each project, how much is enough and not too much, gets figured out specifically. But there are a couple of things which allow us to take more of that approach than might be possible through government channels. One is we have flexibility. We have flexibility to say no and not do it. If we were a government contractor, we had government funding, They said you're going to do what people say needs to be done, whether or not you actually think it makes sense. So we can vote with our dollars. So that's one dimension of flexibility, which is really critically important. The other is to, if we say we're going to fund the veterinarians, we didn't put $100,000 into an account all at once. That was based on things happening, and if those things hadn't happened, the money never would have been released. And that would have been it. So it would have, otherwise it would have been wasted. So the flexibility part is not just what we do, but how we approach it, which alongside the folks who really are focused on these issues, the teams that we work with, works pretty well. So there are a couple of things. I'll just say, for the social entrepreneurs in the group, how this got started back in 2003 when I really knew no one, was to reach out through mill bloggers who were writing about what was happening in Iraq and Afghanistan, and said, yeah, if you know anybody downrange, tell them about this. So that was how it got started. Now it's much more, I'll say, institutionalized, and it's partly because we've worked with a lot of folks and there's word of mouth that happens. So that's one kind of natural way. The other is that we are, especially on the civil affairs side, becoming integrated into schoolhouse training back at Fort Bragg. So Ryan was there 2 days ago to brief teams going down to South America, which is where he'll be focused after a little time in Afghanistan. So the pre-deployment briefing is really important, and so we know who we need to talk to, not everybody, but we know who we need to talk to establish those relationships. Sometimes they reach out to us because they've heard about us or what have you. Sometimes we make sure to reach out to them. Ryan was, a week or two ago, participated in the civil affairs culmination exercise for people in the Q course down at Fort Bragg, the Sluss Tiller exercise. So integrating ourselves into that training, we do it on our own dime. We fly out there, we spend the time and everything else. We're not funded for that either by the government. But getting into that thinking before people are deployed is one way. And then in Afghanistan more specifically, we have good, while we work in a decentralized way, I should say it's informed decentralization. So we're not just out there with teams freelancing. There's higher level awareness of what we're doing, why we're doing it. There's guidance to focus on certain places, which is why some teams might hear about us when they're deployed and others might not. So it's through those different mechanisms. Some of the guidance from higher levels, the pre-deployment briefings, schoolhouse training, and then just word of mouth sort of. Mainly at Fort Bragg, but not exclusively. So we've done a lot on that with, we try to understand who's heading over and where they're going to link up with them beforehand. Most of what we're focused on now is on these projects outside of Afghanistan, and that is usually special operations led, the non-direct action, the so-called indirect approach on special operations. So that, we are linked in at Fort Bragg, but also other spots. And Ryan is a Green Beret veteran, so he also has, with the teams heading down to South America, he knows folks on the non-civil affairs side that we reach out to. So in terms of why different and why better, I would say if someone else is able to do what needs to be done, we want them to do it. So we're only doing things that no one else can or will do.
Right.
So in Mauritania, there were, as I mentioned, there are no NGOs out in that area. There are no, one of the issues from a aid and assistance standpoint, I'll just say with USAID, is they do things through implementing partners. They have to have implementing partners who will do these things. And out in some of these areas, it's pretty hard to come by. You need to get the ball rolling in the right direction, you need to be really alongside both the military, people who can protect themselves. And the folks who go out there, I didn't talk a lot about this, but everything that was done in that Mauritania project was done side by side with the Mauritanian military and their fledgling civil affairs group as well. But that was a collaborative effort, just from a security standpoint. So the main thing is, well, they're just not doing it. And when we go into an area, and this was the process in Mauritania, again, by talking to people who knew way more about this than any of us did, to find out, well, who's doing what, who knows what, who can we get to help and play a role. So it's a little bit of a role of network manager, if you will, rather than, hey, we're the NGO who's going to do all the work. They're telling Dave, we try to do as little work as we can, because if other people can do it, we want them to do it. Our supporters don't want us to just run around and do things for the sake of doing them, only if it's important and it's not being done by others. The thing that you see is, so that's one set of answer to that. The other is that the conventional NGO community has a very uneasy relationship with any military personnel. Yeah. So that is what it is. We're not critical of that. It just is what's happening in most of these environments. So even for folks who might have expertise, they don't want to follow the military's lead and kind of be in a support role. It violates universal humanitarian principles. Yeah. So it's not maybe not a good thing for them to do that. So that's one of the reasons. And the third I would say is, since we're not, the biggest difference apart from those couple of things is being privately funded is, it's a simple idea, but being privately funded as opposed to publicly or government funded is a huge difference. And it allows you to have the flexibility to do things or not do things, as I was saying earlier. And it's just, so it's I wouldn't say it's better than the other approach, but it's different in some important ways. And for us, it's, well, you need both. You need both the neutral and not neutral working together as much as possible as you can. So on the coordination and deconfliction piece, that is also something that's really important. And how that happens is, I'll say pretty simple, but it's by asking the people who were there, who were working these issues day in, day out, so the U.S. team, and it's not just the military team, but we politely insist on talking to whoever else is around on the U.S. side and their host nation counterparts to understand who's doing what, and that we're not duplicating efforts. Now, again, in the case of Mauritania, I'll just keep picking that example since we talked about it, just there's nothing happening out in these areas. There was no deconfliction because there's no potential for conflict in that regard. But having people aware of what we're doing and working with the players, in this case the Mauritanian government itself, the Center for Veterinary Research is a government entity, they just weren't funded to do the work, is one of the ways to mitigate that problem, I would say. And the last part on outcomes and evidence on outcomes, it's it's always a challenging thing, and I would say for us it's in a way especially challenging because we just don't do one thing. The examples I gave in Panjway, stuff for Afghan police and things for that is, so each one of those things has its own purpose. It fits into a broader campaign plan for the U.S. team. And so sometimes it is the only evidence that can exist is anecdotal. In the case of the veterinarians, that's a lot of things that can be measured in that one. In some cases, the only evidence really is anecdotal, and especially when it comes to the question, as you said, of better relationships and trust. That is, even if you could do a survey, I'm not sure people would actually tell you if you could do it and have it be meaningful. That's just a kind of sharing my pain with you on that it's hard to do, which you already knew. So we look at the projects, and the more we invest in terms of time and money, the harder we look at them. The main thing is not to have negative consequences, so I think we're pretty good at that part of it, as we discussed a moment ago. But on the outcomes, it is yeah, so a couple things. One is there have been some good studies done, I think, by folks at UCSD about SERP and what works and what doesn't. And what they found that there was a correlation between not all aid projects, but small-scale targeted projects and reduction in violence. Now, Iraq is a complicated place. It doesn't last, those gains didn't last forever. I'm not sure if anything can be done to address the long-term picture. But in terms of the correlation between small-scale SERP projects and violence reduction, there's a pretty good correlation. The big ones, not so much. So that's apart from us. We're not SERP funding. So again, just for time, I'll focus on Mauritania. So there are a couple of things that are evidence of that, that this has worked. One is these guys are still at it. And we know that solving their community's biggest problem is defined by them. Well, I was going to say we know, but we're going to assume that that's a helpful thing to improve stability and resiliency of these communities. Second thing is the connection between the regional and national government did not exist before. I'll say no or assume that that's a good thing to do. The other part that's a little bit more objective, still anecdotal, I guess, is all this was done, at least the first part of it was done leading up to a big military exercise in Mauritania called Operation Flintlock. And it's a multinational effort, all these West African nations, the US and its allies, doing military exercises to help establish government presence in certain areas where there's a security risk, send a message, build capacity and all the rest. So what this project was one of its objectives was what's called a shaping operation for Operation Flintlock, so that it would all go off well. And again, it's hard to establish the exact correlation, but Operation Flintlock in these remote areas where, again, people are not just running out and hugging Americans and even the Mauritanian military, it went off beautifully. So that's an answer there. But on the broader one, it's tougher to have. Each project has its own objectives.
Just a quick comment on that. The corollary to proving it is we can't disprove it either. And to me, personally, I think it's worth the investment to try and to make these efforts, because I think although the evidence is anecdotal, there has been good things, but I don't think we can disprove and say that they don't work either.
Yeah, and we have the same problem proving that peacekeeping works or
right.
proving that development aid works.
Right.
We just
Yeah,
struggle with all of those measures. So it's not just you.
No, for sure. And I see things that make no sense on that international aid and development community. I'm not going to pick any examples because I'm not an expert in this. But to me, make no sense at all. And one of the chief things that makes no sense at all to me, is using these large-scale kind of top-down approaches when what we know works in our own country in terms of the most dynamic and innovative economy in the world is this really messy, success and failure, bottom-up kind of thing. And so how we can do, so the coordination piece, as you mentioned, with the UN, critically important, but the idea that you can kind of centrally plan some of these things, again, far more informed people than I have, spend their whole lives on this. So this is just a business guy's perspective. But those things don't make all that much. Those approaches are, I question, I guess, is the best way to put it.
Audrey?
So I have, hi Jim, my name is Audrey. Thanks so much for coming to speak with us this afternoon. I have one question and one comment, and the question is more on the business model. You touched on that Spirit of America is a private-public partnership. I'm a former Army officer. I know very, very well the long, protracted ODACA process as well as the federal acquisition regulations constraints. It's great that there's money that allows your corporation to be flexible, and you don't wonder where your capital comes from. Is this private donations? Are there shareholders? Where does your money come from?
Yeah, so we're a charitable, 501c3 charity, so these are all gifts or donations, one level or another. There are, historically we've had done a lot through essentially a crowdfunding model where people can give to specific projects and 100% of their donation goes to that project. So people can give, and I encourage everyone here to do it as soon as this is over.
Choose your project.
Could give to the project in Mauritania, and 100% of their money goes to the cost of that. So that's the targeted or 100% earmarked giving. And so we've had donations from $10, up to higher amounts. Over the last couple of years, with these projects outside of Afghanistan, where many people, members of the public, don't even know where the country is, much less, there are U.S. personnel there, much less why they're there. Our focus to get this going and figured out has been much more on the larger donor, the donor of larger amounts, which are some on the foundation side, and individuals who have a great interest in security issues and are looking beyond the next thing that's on the front page to try to, like as General Cleveland said, avoid the next war. That's easier said than done, obviously, but there are people who really care about that sort of thing, happily, who saw what we did or didn't do after the Soviet Union left Afghanistan, and you remember the last frame of the movie Charlie Wilson's War. I won't use that indelicate expression, but who don't want to see that happen again. Well, so I think it's a great idea for us to do more of that, and getting better and more systematized in the measurements of effectiveness is something that's important for us to do in these environments, which is outside of Afghanistan is easier because they're more, generally speaking, more permissive. So we've been able to do that. Again, Mauritania, we've been able to engage and talk to both the folks that we work with and so forth and so on. We haven't done the quantitative studies yet, but it's an area that is of great interest to us. One of the things, I'll mention a CSO, Conflict and Stabilization Operations Bureau project that is starting off with that. So we're working with a CSO team who's focused on Syria, and what this part of CSO is doing is funding and assisting independent radio stations to have an alternative voice and a more objective source of information than any certainly the government media or the more extremist media. So their conversation started with, hey, can you help us with radios for these stations to hand out, hand crank radios for places where power is intermittent. Can you help us with some radios? And I think we'll probably do that, but what we started with was a study of the effectiveness of these stations. So we thought, well, why help them be more successful with what they're doing isn't making any difference to begin with. So we worked with our partner, we contracted with Karis Associates, who had an on-the-ground network, actually through a USAID contract, where they could add on questions specific to this issue. And based on that, we are doing the next phase, and again in collaboration with CSO, of helping a couple of the stations, not all of them, take it to the next level. So that's an example, at least on the front end, and we'll do the back end piece of it as well, to see what kind of effect the support had. So it's not always possible, and we don't always have the funding to do what we ideally would like to do.
Well, we're out of time, and so I'd like to thank everybody for being here, for great questions. But I'd really like to thank Jim and Spirit of America and Ryan for joining us here. I think I can speak for all of you that we, well, at least for me, I heard some things that I'd never heard before in terms of this kind of work, and I think it's very exciting, and it makes an important contribution. And I think public-private partnership is important, and it's something I think we should encourage. And I'm grateful for the work that Jim has done and your organization. So thank you very much.
Great, pleasure. Thanks for coming.